expand the screen here and see the cast of characters that we're dealing with here today. Okay.
Yeah, you probably still have some more coming on.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, we'll wait a few minutes. So what are we expecting out of today? Come on now, you didn't sign up just because I was the host for this thing. I know
you always have something interesting and informative and exciting, and so I just jumped on for the surprise.
Okay, well, I've got one for you. You won't be disappointed. So
Rick,
what else?
I love the idea of working with multiple generations. There's something about that that really appeals to me, the challenge of it and the emotional part of it. So I want to learn more.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good topic, and one always learns things from the Learning Labs. So got to be open.
Got to be open, exactly. What else?
I don't think you can avoid it, especially in group engagements.
No, it's a given.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with the millennials being the largest part of the workforce now. It cracks me up that people still refer to the millennials as kids, in their reference. They're pushing 40, so no, they're not kids anymore. So cool. What else? What else can we cover off on today? All right, well, let's get the party started then. Let me get the, you can see from the title, Coaching Multiple Generations, and we'll talk about, here's some of the things that we'll talk about. When I was working with Wendy on how to frame this out, a couple of the ideas were around, does Advanced Insights actually tell us anything about, how to coach across multiple generations? And so we'll look at that and look at, I'll actually use my current client base as example. And then we'll talk about the impact that it does have on coaching. And then I've got a couple of exercises that I've used, and we'll just share them with you as possible ways to really get the most out of a multi-generational conversation. So here is my current coaching base. And because you can't become a client of mine without taking the Advanced Insights, I've attached everybody's assessment results, if you will. So I'll just leave those up there. And my question is, what do you see? Do you see any correlations? Do you see any trends? Do you see anything that might jump out at you that possibly gives you some insights as to what might make that generation unique? For those that hey Tom, how you doing?
Eric, sorry.
So you can see the three groups here: baby boomers, Gen Xers, and Gen Y. I don't coach any 22-year-olds, so Gen Z hasn't hit my radar yet.
The Gen Y are more, their values are more politically oriented than certainly than the boomers.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely got some control freaks in the crowd. I say that tongue in cheek, obviously. What else do you see?
Well, they're mixed.
Yeah. So what does that tell you?
Age isn't necessarily the determining factor.
Yeah, it isn't. And just for grins and giggles, neither is gender.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I've sliced and diced my base, I've done it by race. I've done it by age. I've done it by gender. I've done it by, I work 3 business verticals. I work nonprofits, I work small business, and I work corporate leadership teams. And no matter which way you slice it, the advanced insights is good. I mean, obviously it's a good tool. I've certainly done it, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times. But as a predictor of what it's like, or a predictor of what might give you some insights as to how a team or somebody of a certain age might, how you might coach them based on that by itself, based on the age, based on the demographic of age, it doesn't really. Any thoughts as to why? Any thoughts as to why? Or we use it. Why wouldn't it be a predictor of, you know, why a boomer would work with a millennial, or Xer would work with aYer?
Well, they always say that some part, like on the disc, unless there's been a major event, same with values, they don't really change over time. So then why should they be different across age groups?
Okay. Now, is that to suggest that, you know, is there really a generation, are there really generational differences in boomers, Xers, and Y? Some would argue that there's no science that says that there is. Now, I would agree, and I say this in my presentations, I would certainly agree that biologically, a 20-year-old is a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old is a 40-year-old, and et cetera, et cetera. So what are the differences that we're really talking about? Because there are differences. You know, the generations do have differences, but it's not necessarily biology. What do you think it is?
Well, I mean, I would think that I would have expected differences because you're in a different part of your life cycle, your career development, you know, whether you're the eager beaver trying to get started, whether you're trying to maintain it, or whether you're, you know, at the end slowing down, or family, you know, pre-kids, having kids, young kids, you know, empty nesters, that changes your kind of everyday reality.
Okay. And so that would be true. Those of us that have been around long enough to have gone through the, let's say, the disc, you know, half a dozen times and seen the results change over time. I'm still a high D. I'm not as high a D as I used to be, but I'm still a high D. And I've seen it gradually, as with maturity, gradually seen it ebb a little bit. So when we were in
I have to ask you this, Rick. You think in the preconceived notion is that in the boomer generation that, you know, we're sons and daughters of poverty and tradition and getting through the war and what have you. And so that kind of weighed into us. And it's also about, you know, we get along, you know, also the preconceived notion is that the new generation should say, with the politics that go along, it's very, very divided, and people, you know, will, at least I've seen this in my family, so to speak, is that I just can't believe that, you know, kids that are of these ages, just because of their political beliefs, will not get along in a friendship. And that's just something just totally foreign to what we were raised with. So that's just one observation I had.
Okay. And what does that tell us about, as coaches, what does that tell us about going into a multi-generational scenario?
You're going to
About
have
preconceived notions.
Preconceived notions. Well, you're going to have this. I mean, I'm seeing it right now, when if in a situation where, I've got 6 kids, so to say, and I'm getting remarried, and the ones that are very conservative, it's amazing. They're in a conservative area and they're very conservative, and the people that are liberal and social progressive and they just don't get along, and they fight with each other very, very insistently, and there's no give. So
Okay.
and that, you're trying to coach around that. Yeah, you got to coach around that.
I think one of the things that the assessments allow you to do with those groups is kind of neutralize the emotional base. So you take it from a facts base. This is how you are innately wired. This is how your colleagues are innately wired. This is how you deal effectively with each other.
Mhm.
Or these are the things that, are going to cause you to butt heads because you're wired differently. So I think if you can use the assessments in those group settings more on kind of the facts-based management of just laying it out, like this is how it is, and either you want to use that to be more effective or you don't.
Yeah, and what you're spot on as far as it's really what is behind the results, right? We've all seen the chapter in the leadership development on we're all products of our past. And so that really does, that's what heavily plays into the multi-generational coaching forum is, yes, biologically 20 is 20, 40 is 40, et cetera. But what were the influences when I was 20 versus the influences that somebody who's 27 was 20, right? And so it's those influences, those values, those attitudes. So that's where the difference is in the generations is in their formative years, they all were exposed to different life situations, different things that form the attitudes and of course the values. If you look at I think it's Morris Massey that came up with the 3 stages of values creation from 0 to 21 years of age. And so when you look at how those values are formed, and then you look at the attitudes that come from those values, then you start to understand where the advanced insights can start that conversation. But we need to understand how to take that conversation and explore, okay, what were those influences that brought those conservative views or those liberal views or progressive views that Dave, you're talking about? What are those, what's underneath all that? Because if we're all in the habit change business, if we're all in the attitude adjustment business as coaches, then it's at that level that we're going to have to dig in and figure out, what's really going on here. Other thoughts as you look at the fact that they're really
Well, I think that the point that Dave made is really perplexing me, because we use DISC not only to help people understand themselves, but to help them understand how to get along with others. And us boomers, we believe that results often are the result from collaboration. And you give a little to get a little, and that's been a time honored methodology that we've all used to get to where we need to go, whether in our personal lives or in business. And you hear Dave talk about his example where there's just an unwillingness to even listen to the other side, not even collaborate.
One of the things that when you look at conflict, and I've done a learning lab on conflict in the past, but if you remember, one of the definitions or one of the components of conflict is that there's an interdependency. I would suggest that the kids don't have that interdependency. They don't have a need right, that a team does to resolve those differences. You know, I mean, up where I live here in Chicago, and I use this example, you know, you got a Bears fan and a Packers fan sitting in a bar. You know, is there conflict? No, there's disagreement. You know, somebody has poor judgment, but there is no conflict because there's really no interdependency there. And so it's that interdependency that gives, so when we work with teams that are multi-generational, they have that built-in interdependency. They have a common mission, a common goal, a common reason why they have to figure it out. Siblings can just agree to disagree and fight more than siblings typically do. Other thoughts?
I just take it you weren't talking about the Bear fan when you said one of them was just wrong.
Well, since I'm a Colts fan.
Okay.
You know, but all my audiences are generally Bears fans or Packers fans. So I just kind of throw that one out there and let them figure out who I'm talking about. But yeah, both my parents grew up in Baltimore. So I grew up learning the game of football, watching Johnny Unitas, and learned the game of baseball, watching Brooks Robinson and Frank Robinson play baseball. So.
Well, Rick, it could be worse. I live 40 miles north of Boston. I'm a Yankee fan and a Giant fan. So.
Ooh, man, talking about, you know, in enemy territory.
Yep.
So, well, cool. So this idea that obviously the advanced insights has value, or, you know, obviously I wouldn't use it to the extent that I do, but it's true. There really isn't any predictive nature to how men and women are going to work together, or that different generations are going to work together. So when I talk about generations, this is probably the key slide that I use whenever I debrief the assessments. So obviously assessments are a place to begin the conversation with a set of tangible reference points, but assessments are not the conversation. Anybody have similar thoughts on that, or different thoughts on that one? The reason I bring it up is because these two questions, obviously, in the second bullet, provide the context. And that's really what we're talking about here, is in what context does it matter? In what context is a multi-generational team or group working? And so this is key to when we use the assessments. And of course, what I showed you are just all my one-on-one clients. It doesn't include the team groupings that I work with as well. But in the grouping, obviously I show the team profile of the 3 different assessments, and we have similar conversations. How is this helping the team do achieve what it needs to achieve, or how is it somehow holding the team back? But we don't focus on age. It's just like, so I coach 3 Black female CEOs. And I was having a conversation last week with one of them, and you know, just about the demographics and the psychographics, and just how to manage that, because on her team she's getting a lot of the identity politics and the like. And I said, well, it fundamentally starts with, they have to see a leader first. They don't have to, if they see demographics first, then it's gonna skew the conversation. They need to see leadership first. And so we had a great conversation about, you know, what that means and the like. And so the point of all that is that it's the context. It's not the demographics themselves. It's the context in which those demographics are being applied. And so the next slide is, this is the exact slide I use to summarize my generational keynotes, my generational diversity work that I do with teams. And I think it's important to, because a lot of these are attitudinal. We just have to believe that every generation brings something positive to the party, right? You just have to believe that, right? If your experience is otherwise, then we have that conversation. You know, if you're, because, you know, let's face it, left to our own devices, you know, we can easily fall into these conversations of, you know, those damn millennials are just entitled. They're just little snots that, you know, can't, you know, have a work ethic that, you know, is worse than my dog. These are all real statements that I've heard, by the way. So I'm not making this stuff up. And then of course you have the reverse of that. You know, those damn boomers are just a bunch of dinosaurs. They can barely spell technology, let alone use it. So, you know, there's these perceptions that, and these attitudes that I say, well, in one of the reasons why my generational diversity conversation workshops have been so popular is that I don't bang on any one generation positively or negatively. I look at the pros and cons of all ages. And this is feedback that I've gotten from people that have actually, I had an association, a manufacturing association that liked what I went to their convention one year and they liked it so much, they brought me back and had me do the exact same presentation the next year. So, which I don't think happens a lot. But this idea that we start with every generation has something to bring to the party. And then we look at age as a demographic. You know, we don't lead demographics. We don't coach demographics. We coach people. And so the idea that these in fact are generalizations, but they give us a place to, like assessments, they give us a place to start the conversation. Questions or thoughts?
Rick, a question. This is Sandy.
Sure.
Have you experienced, you know, when you dig deep with the different individuals, maybe from several, you know, different generations, but maybe they share a similar type profile.
Mm-hmm.
When you dig into it at all, do you find that the way they define what that means to them, their, you know, what is success to them, what is, you know, whatever kinds of things, do they define it differently at all? Or do you find that the way they view what they're looking for and their attitudes about it and so forth, do they view them the same, or is in fact there a difference, not in the, you know, the sort of general overall approach, but in their view of it?
Well, I mean, if I'm understanding the question right, you know, there's an expression, we don't disagree on the facts, we disagree on the interpretation of the facts. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, yes, that when we say we agree that everybody has to communicate in order to make this work, we have to collaborate in order to make this work. Well, collaboration to a baby boomer is gonna look different than collaboration to a Gen Xer or a millennial. And so but that continues the conversation, right? It's because we all know that development by definition is helping people improve in the context of their job, in the context of the work that they do. That's what separates it from training. And so it's actually good that when we get that we have the conversation. Okay, so where's the center of mass then? You know, if we have many of you may have seen the graphic, the 5 blind men touching the elephant. So each one of the 5 describes the elephant differently depending on whether one's holding the tail, the trunk, the tusk, the foot, and I think the other one's the ear. So they all describe it differently, but it's still the same elephant. So good question, yes, but that just helps the facilitation take a much richer tone. Good
Yeah, no,
question.
yeah, no, exactly. I was just thinking that, their concept of what is success in business might be I mean, and I think it would be a really rich discussion about that, and could actually clarify a lot of things, maybe where there were some gaps in it. But I just wondered if that was something that you had observed.
And we do run into it. We run into the how, right? The generations, they may agree on the why and the what, but they start to diverge in many cases greatly on the how. And that is especially true when we talk about effective communications. Because communications is it's the number one issue in business today. I don't care whether you're for-profit, nonprofit, government, communications is the number one issue. And so we use that as the catalyst for the differences that everybody, especially in how they do it, and their comfort level with, the younger workforce and their comfort level with technology versus, the boomers who grew up in a face-to-face world. Because that's where a lot of the perceptions, and that's why, this bullet, around attitude is such a critical piece. If you think they're entitled snots, then the next one you see is going to look just like that. If you think they're dinosaurs, then the next one you see is going to look like that. I mean, we've all read the story in the leadership development process. Other questions? So here's how I coach them. And I call this the layers of us. It's not a sexy title, but it's the one I work with. We start off with this base of demographics, whether it's age. Well, you see you can see the graphic there. Age, race, gender, location. I've actually worked with and made decisions, not necessarily as a business coach, but in my corporate career, made decisions on where to locate a call center based on where the population, the target population is based. Because if you take if you put a call center in Atlanta, Georgia, that is primarily there to support the tri-state, New Jersey, New York, that area, you could run into some challenges, some communication challenges, perception challenges. Somebody's giving you talking too slow on the phone for a New Yorker. You just run into those issues. So that's the base. That's where we start. That we build that base, and we know what we're working with. Psychographics. Here's where the advanced insights really comes into play, because it tells us something of personality, values, attitudes, behaviors, etc. So now we have this, we're starting to, we know the foundation, or at least from a quantifiable way, we have the foundation. But here's the only thing I coach. I just coach the person. And so while the advanced insights certainly comes in handy as far as the questions to ask, ultimately it's the answers that are going to help define that red triangle at the top. And so that's it. I can honestly say that the advanced insights is a great tool to get me to this place, but then I rarely go back to it unless the conversation specifically goes into and touches on whether them getting to who they need to be calls for it. Questions? How does this differ from the way you use or maybe or have used in situations where you've coached multiple generations? Who has coached a multi-generational team? Tom?
Rick, this may not be an answer to your question, but it applies to the topic. A number of years ago, I had his title, one of the more bizarre scenarios I coached in that the organization was an order of nuns.
Interesting.
And this man's position was he was a director of communications and marketing, and they were global. They had missions around the world, still do. And he came to me, usually there's a triggering event when someone individually reaches out for coaching. And his triggering event was that he had a young millennial that had left, and it never worked out. And the person left, and he just said, I just don't do well communicating with millennials. And by the way, I have among part of my team, I have an 81-year-old nun who is our social media expert. So as the engagement unfolded, it wasn't about the millennial that he had issues with. The person wasn't a good fit. When you have a cause-based, not-for-profit, you need somebody. I mean, ideally, the ideal people, the dream job for these people, they would usually sign up because they believe in the cause. And so you can see what the motivators would be in that case. Motivators, driving forces, the values, if you will. And this person just didn't care about the cause. And so is there any wonder that it didn't work out, that she wasn't engaged? And it really wasn't about her demographics.
And so where did it break down? It didn't break down with hiring the person. It broke down even before that.
Probably she wasn't a good fit.
Right.
And so it was going to be difficult to engage her because, her values did not really align all that well with pretty much most of the people that were there. Certainly the nuns.
Well, and that speaks to it speaks to the fact that there's a breakdown in the hiring process, right?
Right.
In other words, they really apparently didn't know or didn't try to figure out what a good fit would have been, or they wouldn't have made that mistake in the first place.
Agreed.
And so that's where, it's like anything else. If you don't know what you're looking for, anything will fit. And so that's obviously a place where the advanced insights assessment can really help out. But that starts with more of an attitude of, well, I'll just hire a millennial just to say I've got a millennial. It's the same, silly argument that, we're gonna promote more females so that we can say we have more females, or, pick a category. But that's what I get on a rant with all these bullshit press releases about how much money is being thrown at DEI, knowing full well that they're probably not going to do a whole lot beyond that. And that just, frosts me a little bit. But nonetheless, we're not here to talk about that. But we will in a second. It's kind of the surprise I mentioned earlier. So then what does that tell us about when we talk about multi-generational teams? What are we really learning from this conversation about maybe how we change up our approach? What do you think?
I'll chime
Rick,
in.
I'm sorry for putting this out here about this. And I had a discussion with someone this morning. It was on a board situation, and we got into a big issue on culture. And to me, I saw culture as a code, as saying that you don't like someone because of X, Y, and Z, or on a positive side, they have to embrace the way we feel, so to speak. And I just felt that for some of the younger people, and I've taken them through some of the advanced insights and intermetrics and what have you, is you got to be a little bit more, elastic, so to speak, in your culture to understand that they see things a little bit different than, so they say, some of us older traditionalists do.
Well, here's the fact. Boomers boomers still carry a load of the financial wealth, although the Gen X is due to inherit somewhere between 41 and 43 trillion dollars over the next 4 or 5 years from the traditionalist and boomer parents. And so the truth of the matter is Gen X and baby boomers are now immigrants to the world that millennials and Gen Z are in charge of. We're constantly playing catch up because it's the pace that is accelerated due to technology in many respects that we just have to get comfortable with. So who's defining the culture, I guess, is my point. Who's defining the culture? Is it a culture that we're trying to fit millennials into one that is baby boomer centric or Gen X centric? I'll give you a quick example. I was given this presentation, a multi-generational presentation out in Seattle. Again, the manufacturing association. And you could, of course, there were no millennials in the room. Manufacturing and millennials somehow just, at least 6 or 7 years ago, wasn't their favorite industry to get into. So I was getting the crowd really lathered up about millennials, and one of the questions was from somebody who owned a business, said, well, how do we get them to work our way? What do you suppose my answer was? Pretty simple.
What is your way?
What's your way?
Well, I said, you don't. I didn't care. It didn't really matter what their way was. I said, you don't. I said, you need them more than they need you. So how are you going to adapt to that? We all have to adapt to the workforce if we want that workforce to work for us. I mean, we can hold the line and say, either do it this way or don't apply. I get it. There's some industries that have strict rules about how things are done and all that sort of thing. But that's where this whole attitude about work ethic creates a bias that actually prevents a multi-generational workforce, because one thing we know about millennials is if they don't like the culture, they have no problems with saying, see you later. Whereas we baby boomers at the same age, we just sucked it up because there were 16 people behind us that would take our job. So it's a different, it's really about who's defining the culture. What culture are you really looking to, fit, or how do you define that culture? What else? I knew a couple of people had already stepped in. What's this telling us about coaching a multi-generational team?
Hey, Rick, I just wanted to chime in earlier. You asked a question and I was going to say, well, bottom line is what you mentioned by identifying the triangle. You really coach to the person. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have to have that kind of level playing field. It's like what's important to you, regardless of all the other factors that, are around us. It's not really our makeup. So you go to that individual's core. So.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it takes a while to figure out what that core is.
Yeah.
The psychographics, the demographics can help, but the sooner you can draw that out, and the sooner you draw that out of each member of the team and figure out how that all melds into a team, right? Because that is every time I start working with a team, I still find it amazing that when I say, well, okay, here's a definition of a team versus a group, and they, in many cases, first time they've ever heard that. You know, especially the part about a true team holds each other mutually accountable to the goals. A group doesn't have to do that. A group can always go to the team leader or the supervisor or whoever's managing that group. Much like we call a sales team, but sales teams typically aren't the true definition of a team.
Right.
What else? What else do we take away from this conversation so far? Okay, so let's talk about a couple of exercises that I've used to kind of get the party started. So my most recent venture into this is I had a group, it was a YPN, Young Professionals Network, that I was presenting to, and it was bring your boss to the presentation. And most of the bosses at that time were either Gen Xers or baby boomers. And so they were to bring their boss to this presentation. And so what I had them do is, as you registered for the event, I said, what are the top 3 most pressing issues in a multi-generational workforce? You know, what's causing the biggest rub? And so I used essentially by the time I got to the presentation, I used those 3 top issues for a facilitated conversation. Because by asking that question, I didn't have to suppose, or I didn't have to presume that, you know, that what they were losing sleep over. I knew for a fact, based on the survey results, what they wanted to talk about. As you might imagine, the top three issues were communications, work ethic, and decision making. Any surprises there? So communication, that's pretty straightforward. Everybody's got a preferred way that they're comfortable communicating. And so you can have a conversation around, you know, how do we make those ends meet? How do we make sure everybody is being communicated in a way that makes the most sense for the team as a whole? When I was doing Rising Stars, I just let the students figure out, I let them tell me, and that's how I got introduced to GroupMe. I knew nothing of GroupMe until I started doing Rising Stars, and they said, Mr. Lochner, you know, this is what we're going to use to communicate. I said, okay, sign me up. How about work ethic? How would you approach, if they say work ethic is one of the key issues, I'm curious, how would you approach that?
Sandy, you're muted. I know you're trying to speak, but you're muted.
You're still muted.
I'd ask them first individually to share, how do they define work ethic?
Mm-hmm.
You find undoubtedly people have different attitudes about work ethic, and what's the real key part of that? Sure.
Because well, I didn't have a chance to ask them because I didn't know that was going to show up as one of the top 3, but I did provide a definition. Mm-hmm. As part of the presentation. I said, I mean, we could tweak left, tweak right, but fundamentally there's a fairly standard definition of what work ethic is. And if I could get everybody in the room to, or at least most of the people in the room said, is that can we agree that that is a good definition of work ethic? Well, now we can have a conversation around, okay, how is it applied? Right? Now we can start talking about context and what does that mean? And so once again, I share a story. I was given this presentation, the generational diversity presentation, to a supply chain association. And it was intimate enough to where, people could throw in ideas and whatnot. So this Gen X plant manager got up and said, I gave this baby boomer, or this millennial, I gave him a job to do, and I gave him 8 hours to do it. The millennial did it in 4 and went home. Literally just bugged out, said, I'm done. I did my job for today. And he went home. And of course, the other millennials in the room said, yeah, I'd have done the same thing. So it's one of the few times that the audience actually hijacked my presentation, because then they got into it, right? They started going back and forth, and I let it go for about 5 minutes. And when I finally brought it back to the podium, I said, what's interesting about this 5-minute conversation that we just had about the pros and cons of why they should, or, they should have looked for other work, all the usuals. And I said, what's interesting about this 5-minute conversation is not once did anybody acknowledge that this young man just figured out how to do the job in half the time. Right? Nobody even acknowledged it. Wasn't even part of the conversation, because everybody's worried about punch in, punch out, and totally lost the value that this young man brought to the situation. So how would you approach that? How would you have a conversation around what work ethic means to a baby boomer, the generation that invented workaholic, admittedly, which we did, to those that, to the millennials, to the Gen Xers, who are known as the cynical generation. Why do we have to do it? Why do we have to do it that way? To the millennials, who are comfortable being efficient through technology. Thoughts?
I think, Rick, I was just going to say.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say back to, I think you said it earlier, in terms of the attitude, well, this is the way we've always done it. That's the generation that leads the way. So why do we have to change it? That's the way we've always done it. As opposed to when you go to the other side of the generations, you're looking at the millennials and they're like, but there's a better way. It's more effective, more efficient. And, then we could do other things. And you got the ones in the middle that are saying, well, why do it? So I think that that's a great conversation. I know you said you have a surprise, but there's a lot of diversity in that, and honoring that, rewarding the gentleman that brought a different way to the table, as opposed to seeing it, in a pejorative way or negative way. So great topic there.
Is it, do you think this conversation is difficult to have?
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Between generations.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's fixed mindset. This is the way I've always done it. And I've been here. Just listen to how I'm successful. Listen to the way that I've done it, so you can be successful too. Whereas someone else can say, I'm very successful. This is another way to do it. How about seeing it my way?
Right.
So being open and kind of letting down all generations, letting down the guard and being open to hearing a different way, another possibility.
And that's where you get, when that theme enters into the conversation, you can almost read the body language of the boomers who feel threatened by that.
Yeah.
And that, this person half my age is going to take over my job. Well, my response is, if you don't do anything different, a PC on a desk is going to take over your job. So what difference does it make? You're out of a job either way, unless you stay relevant, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole idea of the conversation. It's not to push any one generation aside. It's to say, look, the world is changing. How are you staying relevant? I had the opportunity to engage in a reverse mentoring arrangement when I first started the business. I'm a recovering engineer, as many of you know. So marketing, not my forte, not my strength. I can barely spell it, let alone do it. So, you know, putting my logo on a shirt, that was pretty much taps out my experience as far as marketing goes. And so I engaged a young woman who was literally half my age to mentor me for 3 years while I mentored her on how to start up a business. So I'm literally being mentored by somebody half my age. Now, it takes a bit of an open mind to be able to do that. But if you simply say that the mentor is the one with the most experience to mentor the person with the least experience, that is not an age thing, not in today's world.
Right.
And so that leads me to the second program that I had a chance to actually create with our local chamber. And it was a multi-generational mastermind group. So by design, half the group is over 40 and half the group is under 40. And it is amazing. And I know some of you belong to mastermind groups, but it is amazing some of the rich conversations we've had, because I and a group of others in the chamber members actually helped put it together. But it's just amazing the diversity of thought you get with a multi-generational. And so we forced it that way, right? It wasn't by accident, it was by design. And so we, on purpose, created this opportunity to learn from each other. So these are my two favorite ones as far as facilitating and really getting the conversation leaning a much different way away from, well, you don't do that and you don't do this, and you know you're not as experienced and you're not this and you're not that. It doesn't matter. Everybody brings something positive to the party, and with that attitude, you start to hear that there's richness to the idea. Now, maybe their experience or lack thereof, but isn't that what you really want? You want them to not be afraid to bring ideas forward. They may not all work, but isn't that really the culture you want? So the surprise is, what if we took this same thing and instead of multi-generational, we called it multicultural? Would the conversations be easier or harder? What do you think? How many say harder? Just raise your hand. Come on, show me you're alive. Okay. Harder? Okay.
Different.
All right. In what way?
I think the premise is the same, but you may have different content come out as people have different cultural behaviors or cultural backgrounds that may affect how they've been taught to behave or how things are done.
How is that different than a 26-year-old trying to work with a 56-year-old?
It's not. So that's exactly what I said, is that the content may be different, but it's not necessarily a different conversation.
My experience is that this conversation is harder. It's easier to talk about somebody of a different age than it is to talk about somebody of a different culture.
I mean, age is one aspect of a multicultural group, if you will. Whereas I think the broader range that you might find in a multicultural group, because there's all the different different identities that could be in that. And many of those are very push button issues, potentially more than age. I think people are set in their preconceived notions about age, and that makes it a little difficult. Younger ones about older, older about younger, and all that.
Right.
But I think some other ones are more emotionally based and ergo harder.
Okay, but they're still predicated on, you know, the way men think about women and women think about men, black thinks about white, white thinks about black, gay versus straight.
Yeah.
I mean, you get, you know, they're all based on preconceived notions, which gets me all the way back to this idea that it's the advanced insights, you know, the demographics and the psychographics play a support role. And just like having the conversation with the CEO that I mentioned earlier, if we use the psychographics and the demographics as support rather than the point of connection, then we can have a conversation of who are you as a leader, and we can let that carry the day in whatever way you define success. Thoughts or questions?
So Rick, one of the things that I would say is that, especially when it comes to age, is for older folks, we have a shared experience with younger folks in that we know we have that experience of being their age. It's different when you talk about multicultural issues, because we can never have that shared experience of someone that comes from a different culture. So at least in terms of the age discussion, the intergenerational discussion, yes, the younger people don't have the perspective of having that shared experience as the older person does, but at least the older person has had that common experience of being 22 or 28 or 35 and dealing with those issues that they are intimately involved with now. So I think that's one of the reasons why that discussion tends to be a little easier to have than the multicultural discussion.
I think I appreciate the thought, but I think part of the problem is that the older generation thinks that they've been there, done that. But when going back to my comments towards the beginning of the presentation, when I was 20 and when my kids were 20, I couldn't even relate. As a matter of fact, one of the key aha moments I've had in this journey as a coach is that I'm coaching people to do the things that I learned back in the day, but in a very different way, because the context is different, right? You know, you can look up content on the internet. Context is what we're all about. And so I find myself coaching to a very different context than the context in which I learned to do it in the first place. And so I think that's half true in the sense that the older generation believes that, but it's not true. I think the context is so different that I think it may be a false assumption. But you're right in the sense that if we appreciate the fact that we can't be there, which means we have to do what? You know, a white person can't be a black person. A man can't be a woman in the biological sense anyway. So how do we appreciate the mosaic as opposed to the melting pot, as we talk about in our new DEI chapter? Thoughts? I know we're pushing time.
Empathy.
Well, and empathy comes on the heels of open-minded communication, right? And so if we say nothing, we learn nothing. If we have that conversation, if somebody who's half my age, I can sit down and listen to, if somebody who is of a different culture, I can sit down and listen to, then we all learn. and we're able to have the kind of conversations that, whether it's generational or cultural. So that was it occurred to me as I was putting this together and having worked with Bertha and a few others on Steve on the DEI chapter, it occurred to me that, it's the same conversation in a different context.
Yes, let's stretch to get better.
Yes, absolutely. So with that, any final thoughts or questions? I always like to leave with a challenge. So call to action. If we do nothing, we gain nothing. So any final thoughts or questions I can share before we sign off?
Just one for you, Rick. We really boiled it down to acceptance and tolerance and learning. So whether or not it's multicultural or whether or not it's an age difference, is if people can be open to it, then you'll have in a better situation. And then I guess your recommendation is, if for an organization where you're not getting tolerant people, is your recommendation to senior management to fire them, or just continue to work with them in the ordinary course?
Well, I think it depends. Everybody deserves an honest chance, but if we're sugarcoating our questions as coaches, we're not doing them any favors. I've already had several very rich conversations by asking, so what was it in your past? What were those past events or influences that underpin your attitude right now? That's a kind of straight to the heart kind of question. And I've had women say their parents would not allow them to go on a date. White women their parents would not allow them to go on a date with a Black man. So that left an impression. So, it's those influences, no judgment one way or the other, but you have to reach back and say, this is why I think this way. And we're not asking those questions. The diversity training is not getting to the heart and soul of what the real issue is. And so again, whether it's multi-generational, gender, lifestyle, you make a difference. There are influences. We all know that. That's the common denominator. We all know that our value set underpins all of this stuff. So let's tap into it. And we as coaches are best prepared to be able to do that. My humble opinion, of course. Okay. Wendy, I think that's it.
Yep. I wanted to say thank you for taking your time to work with the team, Rick. If you wouldn't mind, could you send me a copy of the presentation so I can add that to the affiliate website with the video?
Sure. Minus the demographics. But yeah, I'll send the rest of the slides. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Rick. This was great.
All right. Have a great one.
You too.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.